Hi, how's everyone doing? I'm Frank O'Brien, and I've been giving this talk a couple times, and I hope you enjoy it. We're going to be talking about how you land on the moon 50 years ago, 55 years ago, during the Apollo days. And I have a little presentation here, and if I have the authority to share my screen, and Shane, if you can verify that. Oh, here we go. And let me see if I got this right. I love technology, don't you? And what we're going to do is go back and forth a little bit between the presentation and live. And I think it's going to work out pretty well. All righty. Let's see if this works. Oh, come on, technology. You're supposed to be kind. All right, well, we'll stop share, share again. I've been in so many Zoom meetings, I should be able to master this. And it's not working.
I can see it now. I think you got it.
Okay, you're good?
Yeah, I see the presentation.
Oh, super. Great, great, great. Maybe technology isn't failing us like I was worried. Anyway, so this is the world going to the moon as seen from the computer. Yeah, we could talk all day about the specific procedures, and we will actually get into that a little bit. But the entire idea is we had a completely marvelous system on board the Apollo spacecraft. One of the great things is that it really was incredibly advanced. And we're going to be talking just a little bit about that. But anyway, let's see if I can make this work. Come on, silly. Yes, here we go. Okay, just a couple quick words about me. I have been working at InfoAge, or volunteering really, for the last 15 years or so. About 25 years ago, I became one of the editors of probably the singular most recognized source of information on the Apollo moon landings. And this is the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal and the Apollo Flight Journal. What we do is we take all of the transcripts from the mission. We then annotate it to death with everything from interviews that we've done with the crew to people who are subject matter experts. And we weave that into a tale that is actually quite accessible. Anyway, so about 10 years ago, with all that work behind me, I was accepted as a NASA Solar System Ambassador. And this is just a fabulous, fabulous organization. What we do is we go into the community and explain the NASA mission. The idea behind it is that in everyday life, you really don't have an opportunity to interact with someone who has a direct connection to NASA. And the important thing is no tax dollars are spent on it, except for two people back in the main office at JPL. Everything we do is completely free. We certainly don't accept any kind of compensation. So if you want to get hold of me, we can arrange that. If you have a school group, if you have a library that wants the presentation, I've done 5 of them in the last month. So it is something that really is a pretty decent service that NASA provides. Anyway, important thing. If we're going to be talking about the Apollo guidance computer, the first and most important thing is myth busting. Now, how many times have we heard my calculator, my watch, my microwave? They're all far more powerful than the computer that took men to the moon. And of course, that's nonsense. My watch, if I take a look at it, and it says it's 10 minutes after 10. And that's about it. There isn't any other information that I can get from my watch aside from the time. Yeah, it has a little chip in there. And one of the fun things is that it's very, very good with keeping time. But that's all it does. My microwave, the only thing it does pretty well is, reheat my leftover Chinese. And, well, that's a wonderful thing. And I can adjust the time of stuff. But what we're talking about is a computer that I will argue is just as powerful, if not more so, than your smartphone is today. And that's a bold statement. One of the important things is we have to introduce the idea, or reintroduce the idea of computer power. And we like to talk about, we're all computer people. So the idea is, well, my brand new Dell that I got a couple of weeks ago is a lot more powerful than the laptop I'm presenting on. And we usually measure that in terms of, oh, my clock speed, my amount of memory, et cetera, et cetera. Well, when we talk about power, really, we're talking about getting the job done. It could be a hamster spinning in a cage, and as long as it's grinding out our, presentations and all the rest, it doesn't matter what it is. For example, I have a little Honda Fit, nice little econo box. All right, it's not going to be able to haul, a trailer like a tractor trailer does, but I get a heck of a lot better mileage than a tractor trailer, which is more, powerful. And so we have to start looking a little bit deeper than this. The Apollo guidance computer had incredible capabilities, especially when you understand that it was developed starting in about 1960, even before they got the contract to go to the moon. They were actually trying to design a computer for a Mars spacecraft. So over time, as the requirements just started pouring in, we ended up by the early 60s with a small mini computer, and we'll show pictures, a small mini computer that had full multi-programming. It had an interrupt-driven executive. It had full restart and recovery, which actually saved Apollo 11. One of the key things, and this does tend to blow people away, it ran, depending on the release, 5 to 6 virtual machines. And the beauty of that is that, okay, we can talk, it's not the virtual, environments we're comfortable with today, but it was what can be considered like a Java P code engine or something like that. But it created an entirely different system environment, new opcodes, new capabilities, that sort of thing. And everyone ran in isolated in not in their own address space, but they were isolated from other tasks in the system. Anyway, the reason why we needed all this is that a flight to the moon is impossibly demanding. During the Cold War, it was feared, not rationally it turns out, but these were the original design specs, you had to get to the moon autonomously. None of this fancy stuff where the ground is helping you along and sending your updates and that sort of thing. Also, if you want to land on the moon, you have to be accurate within a few hundred to a few thousand feet. The moon's 250,000 miles away. That kind of accuracy was, well, they thought it was bad science fiction. One of the key things that was introduced, and for the very first time, was a digital autopilot. Autopilots in aircraft of the days were purely analog. The idea of having a small, compact computer do your flight control laws and various other things was, again, a complete breakthrough. And about 10% of the code in the computer was just for the autopilot. Now, the computer handled ascent from the Earth, landing, getting back off from the moon, and entry back on Earth. Each one of those, again, is an incredibly complex task. I challenge anyone, and all the specs are all published, I challenge anyone to be able to do that today in the 36K that the computer ran. And we're going to be talking about the architecture in a second. Reliability and recoverability were paramount. They fully expected to have to send up 2 or 3 computers with a ton of spare parts because digital circuits just simply weren't reliable at the time. One of the benefits, if you want to talk about spin-offs and new technologies that the space program gave you, NASA didn't invent the microchip. They really didn't. But one of the incredible things is that they forced industry to learn how to make impossibly reliable chips. And it turns out none of them ever failed. So that, especially in the early 60s, was a groundbreaking, advancement in technology. Recoverability. Now, I'm a man of a certain age, and perhaps a few of you are as well. Remember the blue screen of death? Well, nowadays you don't get it that often. And the idea that, oh, my application crashed, but the rest of the computer is still working pretty well, this was just simply not heard of. I mean, a computer crashed, you had to reboot it. So we couldn't allow that. Imagine you're landing on the moon for the very first time. We'll make it a silly hypothetical. And all of a sudden the computer software starts crashing. Well, you don't want to abort a $1 billion mission to the moon just because, some silly little problem on Apollo happened. And it turned out the recovery and restart system was brilliant. Not only did it restart everything, no data was lost. And you try doing that in an application today. So I, again, will argue that a lot of these capabilities are equal to what you find on your smartphone today. Oh yeah, the processor was, far, far, far slower. And, again, memory was almost non-existent. But if you look at capability, I challenge anyone to be able to squeeze that onto your iPhone. Now, when we talk about the components of the computer, really it was one of 3 key components needed for guidance and navigation. Remember, the whole idea is that this is the Apollo guidance computer. The guidance computer itself is completely blind, deaf, and dumb to the outside world. It needs some sort of input. One of the great things is that we have the technologies to do this, and we've actually had them for 60 going on 70 years. The other things that are necessary for a flight to the moon and for a computer to guide it there is what's called an inertial measurement unit. We'll talk about each one of these in a little more detail. Sometimes you'll see referred to as an inertial platform. This will tell you which way is up and where you're going, and we're going to get into that. The other thing is that the inertial measurement unit, again, is blind, deaf, and dumb to the outside world. So you have to be able to look out and have some sort of computer interface. And we have an optics system that we'll be talking about that will go out. The astronaut will go and do sightings on stars. And from that, we now have a complete 3-component part of guidance and navigation to the moon. Now, everyone wants a beauty shot. This is what the computer looks like. If you go and find your way, and I know the pandemic is a mess, over at what we call the Diana site, where we have that 60-foot tracking dish that we've turned into a radio telescope, you'll see a prototype of an early version of the Apollo guidance computer that I curate. It comes in 2 different, the phrase is trays. They're about 2 feet long by about 16 inches wide. And when you stack them, it's probably about 8 inches deep. It weighs in at about 75 pounds. It's really densely packed. The lower tray is the CPU. All discrete triple input NOR gates. The upper tray contains memory. And one of the beautiful things is that the memory was what we would consider today ROM, 36K, a whopping 36K. Read-write was only 2K. And that's all you had. And we'll get more into this right now. It was a 15-bit processor. You often hear things that, oh, it was a 16-bit machine. Gee, doesn't that sound a bit modern? Well, that 16th bit was really just for parity. And so it was all parity protected. It really was a general purpose computer. The chip in your microwave or your watch is, probably just a little ASIC that, well, again, it doesn't have to do much. You're not going to be running Linux just to find the time. So it was a complete multi-purpose general purpose programmer. I'll get all my words right. With full multi-programming. You could run up to 7 programs at once. And again, depending on the release, it was either 5 or 6 virtual machines involved in all that. Again, we talked about the idea that you have 2K of RAM. Think of that. 36K ROM for all your programming, and there wasn't any secondary storage. Now, again, I challenge any of you, and again, we all like to think we're pretty sharp in our programming, to put together all the software needed to go from the Earth to the moon and get back home safely in just 36K. Yeah, well, get back to me when you do that. Now, in order for a 15-bit processor to do its work, you need to have reasonably large address spaces. Of course, we didn't have the physical memory, and there wasn't any concept of paging or anything like that. And so during that period, and actually on some old architecture machines today, you have the idea of memory banking, where you actually map into just a few subsets of that entire 36K of memory, and then you're restricted just to that. This kind of memory management brought strongmen to tears. It really was a mess, but that's what was needed to do it. We talked about the virtual machines. These machines, again, were kind of like P-code engines or bytecode engines, and implemented a brand new, extraordinarily powerful machine architecture. And most of the really sophisticated code ran in the virtual machines. You had everything like native matrix multiplications, transcendental functions, that sort of thing. And again, an amazing concept of index registers. The core hardware didn't even have index registers. But again, when we talk about computer power, again, my watch just tells the time. This controlled about 150 devices in both the command module and the Lunar module. Everything from the thrusters to the main engine, to the guidance platform, the optics, a bunch of other stuff. It didn't control any other things, any things that weren't involved with guidance and navigation, the electrical system or the system to give you oxygen. Didn't touch any of those. These were just the devices for guidance and navigation. The key interface, and this is such a brilliant, beautiful device, is called the display and keyboard. We just shorten it to DISKY. It's just a keypad with a few special purpose keys at the bottom, and we'll talk about those keys in a second. We have some status lights that are essential, whether you're having problems that day. And the display screen in the upper right is just 3 rows of numbers. Oh, and it tells you what program you're running and all the rest. When we talk about what program you're running, again, it's a multi-programming system. But when we say, I want to run the landing on the moon program, that is the primary piece of software running, but you have lots of tasks running underneath, like on your Mac or your PC or Linux. You have a zillion threads that are running. This had the same thing. We'll be talking about 2 critical keys on the keyboard, and they're a little bit worn, and they're in the lower left-hand part of it, and they're labeled verb and noun. We'll talk about that in a minute. This is a picture of the interior of the Apollo command module. Now, I was a pilot for 25 years. One of the key things about an instrument panel design is that you want the most important stuff right there in front of your face. You don't want to go hunting off to the side. Here you see the computer in essentially the central place. It was that important. Oh, you had your 8 balls about telling you which way is up, and at the very top center, you have an instrument that monitors your reentry back to Earth. But honestly, it was the central piece of equipment in the command module. On the lunar module, and this is an exhibit I put together at the Cradle of Aviation out in Long Island, you'll see that a couple interesting things. Importantly, there are no seats in the lunar module. You stood for the entire time you were in there. And that was okay. The moon's gravity is only 1/6 what it is today. Even I only weigh about 30 pounds, probably a little less. And the ideal place that the astronauts decided was that they were going to put the computer right where your hand normally falls. There was a ton of keystroke entries, and it was very, very comfortable. And it was accessible to both the commander, who's the suited astronaut you see, and the lunar module pilot, which is not in this picture, but he was off to the right. Pizzas in the disky. I always like this part. Verbs and nouns. Remember how we talked about those 2 keys, verb and noun. This is exactly how we communicate today with every system that we've worked on. A verb is an action to be performed. Even I learned that in grade school. And the noun is the object of the verb. Now, how do you translate that into computer interfacing? Well, say you want to display the time your engine's going to fire. And that's you can imagine that's a popular thing on spacecraft going to the moon. There's a verb to display data. You had other verbs that said, accept my radar data or update information or do a number of other functions. But verb number 16 is display decimal data. Noun 33 is defined as the time of ignition. And so you would enter verb, press the verb key, 16, noun key, 33, hit enter, and on that display will come up in hours, minutes, and seconds when the engine's going to fire. And we could spend hours talking about the interface to the computer, but we really don't have to. You've already learned 90% of what you need to know. That's it. Oh, there's special keys like clear and proceed and all the rest. But this was the language of communicating. It's the exact same thing we do today, verbs and nouns. If you want, you're working on a document, you would say print document, run Excel. We can go on and on. The communication used for the Apollo computer has its own shorthand, but it's exactly the same as what we have been doing for 60 years. Now, let's get on to some of the other toys that are in the spacecraft. The Inertial Measurement Unit. This is an impossibly precise miracle of mechanical engineering. It only does 2 things. It measures the acceleration on the spacecraft and its attitude. From this, we learn which way is up. It's implemented as 3 mutually perpendicular gimbals, and embedded within all of those are the accelerometers. The idea is, with those gimbals, there's gyroscopes that are keeping it fixed in space. And for that, the accelerometers, now being fixed, can easily measure things in the X, Y, and Z direction. All of these acceleration and angles are all sent to the computer. And for, as it goes through its update cycles, it will then update what accelerations, integrates it over time so it has velocity, and then which way it's going. And here's a picture of it. Again, this is a miracle of modern mechanical engineering, well, especially for the early 60s. It's a little tough to see. There aren't any great pictures, and I apologize, but it's about the size of a basketball, give or take, weighed in about 80 to 100 pounds. Temperature control was incredibly important, and it's a little difficult to see, but you can see cooling channels on the outside. It had to be kept within 130 degrees, give or take a degree. And so temperature control was hugely important. Optics. How do you know where you are and which way is up? We're going to talk about that in a minute. It's we need to use a sextant. And there was a small telescope that was more like a sighting telescope. It was actually a 1-power telescope, and the big running joke was only the government could end up spending tons of money on a 1-power telescope. But the idea of sighting the stars has been around for a couple hundred years. The early mariners sat out on the deck, looked at the stars or the sun and the horizon, and are able to figure out quite accurately where the heck they are. From the angles, and again, sextant sightings are all done with angles, all those are sent to the computer, and then from that magic, you can figure out your location just simply using the stars. A little more processing, and the software determines the attitude, position, and velocity of the spacecraft, all of your guidance and navigation needs. Now, when we talk about a sextant, we're not talking about the traditional nautical sextant. If you want to know how to use one of these, go to Mystic, Connecticut, Mystic Seaport Museum. They actually give a weekend course on how to use it. And I took that course. It's a fabulous, great, interesting, trivial thing to learn. But no, they're not using a sextant that looks like this. This is the optics area of the Apollo command spacecraft. It has the sextant on the left, the sextant on the right, telescope on the left, but the principles behind it are identical to what mariners did years and years ago. If you put a seafaring captain of the 1700s into this spacecraft, he would understand what's happening. It's that brilliant. Now, when we're off to the moon, guidance and navigation only have to answer 3 questions. I hope you're taking notes because these are important. First question, which way is up? Good thing to know. Next, where am I? Kind of helpful if you want to know if you're where you're supposed to be. And where the heck am I going? Once you know that, you know everything you need to learn to fly to the moon. So, to the hive mind, which way's up in space? Don't have to answer, but give that some thought. Which way is up?
There is no up unless you provide a reference to what is your definition.
It's any direction you want. 100% right on that. Now, how do we figure out, again, if I'm up at the North Pole and I'm asked to point straight up, I'll be pointing at the North Star. I go down to the South Pole and I'm asked to do the same thing, I'm going to be poking my finger in the exact opposite direction. Well, that's kind of silly. So which way is up even on Earth? Forget about space. So I have a little demonstration on how we do that. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second. And we're going to go, and if I can go and figure this stuff out. Come on. Oh, where's my... Oh, here we go. Stop sharing. All righty. Now, imagine for a moment you're in the Apollo spacecraft, and we have a little, I love my props. Imagine you're here in the big ball. You look through the sextant, and you're looking at a particular star. Let me get back a bit so you can see this better. All right, you take your sighting on that star. Spacecraft right now is motionless. Okay, I know the angle to my star. Now, you take a sighting on a second star. Oops, you don't want to see the paint. So now I have two angles. That's all you need. So, motionless, I could be looking at Sirius and Deneb. Doesn't matter which, but yes, we can make a choice of, I guess, about 35 different stars. Oh, and coordinate systems. There were about 6 different coordinate systems, and I was hoping not to talk about that. We can do that in the Q&A later, but we're going to be establishing one reference system, which then gets rotated mathematically into other coordinate systems. So I've made my two star sightings. Great stuff. Star sightings are good. Now, we know, just basic algebra or trig, we've established a plane in space, just a simple trigonometric plane. From that, I can create a normal to that plane defined by the 2 star sightings. So far, pretty simple, right? Now, I've defined my plane. And this gets a little hairy, but these are the 2 stars. I probably shouldn't have stars on these. I've established my plane and my normal to it. Now, I can establish another vector that I've generated from this little computation. And this is Trig 101. So now I have my 2 stars, my 2 generated axes, if you will. And what I've come up with mathematically is a 3-dimensional fixed reference based on the stars. Now, to dive down a little bit deeper into the question, that's a great reference and a perfect one, but it's also something that may not necessarily be perfectly useful. You wanted to use reference systems that are defined by your landing site or your entry interface or your launch place. So between those, they do get rotated based on that, but they always keep around that fixed reference to the stars. And these were done within about 10 arc seconds of accuracy. It was pretty accurate. So I don't want to run out of time, so I'm going to start rushing, and I apologize. Here we go. Share. And are you seeing my screen?
Yes.
Oh, good. All righty. So now, answering the musical question, which way is up? We've done that, and we've done that pretty well. So, where am I? Using the sextant, we use the exact same techniques. But remember, when you want to know where you are, the key thing is where the question really develops deeper into where am I relative to important things? Like, where am I based on where the Earth and the Moon are? Okay, well, again, now we're getting into the real simple things, but that's still all you need. So I take a sighting on a star, and then I take a sighting on the Earth or the Moon. Because you're going in a curved path, which we understand quite well, we understand that particular angles are going to generate different positions. Now, this is all figured out in 3 dimensions. It's not particularly trivial, but the math is very, very well understood. And so you have certain select stars that you want to use. You will sight on the Earth, either on the brightly lit side or the dark side or the dead center. And those can be computed to figure out exactly where you are on your journey to the Moon or back home. The next, whoops, did I miss that? Well, I hope not. Anyway, so the final question is, where the heck am I going? That's a nice thing to know. I understand that that's a pretty powerful thing that people want to have. All right. Let me just squirt things over here. We already know which way is up and where we are. Now with that, this inertial platform, this IMU, will tell us the velocity that we've gone back and forth on in each direction. And so now we have our velocity vector. We have our position, our velocity, and the equations of motion. Again, they're not things that you want to show off on a napkin. They are a little bit complex, but they're very, very well defined. And so this is dead reckoning. You're not flying powered flight 99% of the time. After you launch and start heading to the moon, you're just coasting. And Isaac Newton and the equations of motion, and yes, gravity and all that other fun stuff that we all learned and probably forgot, are all in command right now. And so you just extrapolate out your trajectory. And again, it was pretty accurate. Again, we were within a few thousand feet at worst in our navigation. Now, when we talk about dead reckoning, again, I was a pilot. This is the local airspace around New Jersey. You can see Newark Airport, about center over to the right, inside those concentric circles. This is an aviation chart. This is what I used for years. I kept my airport at Princeton, which is down at the very bottom over to the left. And if you draw a straight line at about 70-ish degrees, I can fly from Princeton, flying 70 degrees, and it's about 38 miles, give or take. And as long as I keep on that course at, and wait out my 38 miles or however long it is to get to Newark, I can find myself right over the airport at Newark. And that's a pretty clever thing. It's the exact same way we sailed the seas hundreds of years ago. And in the Coast Guard, we still do it today. Now, you think that the bit of hairy kind of navigation stuff, this is what's called an E6B. And I'm going to stop sharing for just a second. Here we go. This was my E6B. It's really just a circular slide rule. And it does regular circular slide rule kind of calculations. But like so many other clever things, it has a lot of special markers on there for time, speed, distance, pressure, altitude, and 100 other things. More sophisticated ones, you can figure out your Mach speed, but honestly, driving a Cessna at 120 miles an hour, you don't have to worry about Mach numbers. It also will allow you on the back to take care of any kind of corrections for the wind and how much it'll affect you. If you have a 10-knot wind coming at you, your 120-knot flight is going to slow down to 110. And so it will you can readjust for how long the wind will affect your flight. Now, this little E6B is probably one of the greatest little inventions. Let me get back here. Is probably one of the greatest little inventions. It's been around since the 30s and effectively unchanged. And I can prove it right here, right now, that this fantastic little device, this little circular slide rule, was used extensively in the 23rd century. And that's a true fact. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Whoops. Come on, dumb thing. And there we have it. I rest my case. Yes, Starship Enterprise was driven by a 1930s era little E6B plotter thingy. And it turns out, a piece of trivia, that's actually Gene Roddenberry's E6B when he was flying during the war. So now you walk away just a tad smarter today. So we're running out of time and I want to zip through this quickly. Landing on the moon. One attempt, no second approaches, and the computer handles almost everything up to the final few minutes right before you land. We break it down into 3 different phases. Slowing down from orbital speed, you're going about 1,700 miles an hour in lunar orbit. So we have to start slowing down. Remember, you want to slow to a stop when you land. And so we start 3 different programs, one that happens right after the other. Program number 63, 64, and 66. Program 63, we start at a couple hundred miles uprange, and it fires the engine in the direction of travel to start slowing you down. You're doing this at about 50,000 feet, which was their target altitude. They usually hit that pretty close. After you really start slowing down, and now you're getting really close to your landing site, about 2 to 3 miles uprange of that site, you change into a different program. The key thing is, one of the brilliant things, one of the horrifying things, is that when you're doing this braking, slowing down, your feet are pointed forward and you're faced upwards. You don't see the moon. All you see is, all the instruments and the computer ticking away. When we get to this approach phase, the spacecraft pitches over. And for the very first time, the crew sees where the heck they are and where they're going. So again, you're still under full control. It's right around here that Apollo 11 had the program problems. And we can talk more about those in the Q&A if we have enough time. When it finally brings you down, and you can correct your position now during the approach phase, you can scoot around, missing craters. Again, Neil Armstrong had to go way off course. He had to go a couple miles away just to find a smooth spot to land. Finally, you're a couple hundred feet above the ground. Now you take over not manual control, call it manually assistant. Remember, the lunar spacecraft was completely fly-by-wire. So the control inputs were actually changed into, modified by the control laws. So you were flying a computer that was actually maneuvering the spacecraft. And this is kind of like a redundant little slide. We have our pre-ignition. We start firing the engine. It goes down. This really isn't to scale, and this isn't the best one, but we have the 3 different phases as you're coming in to land on the moon. So very quickly, and we're going to have to hurry because we're running out of time. These are the computer displays. Just so you wonder, when you find yourself in this position, and again, the whole point of this talk is if you're hanging out in the back of the lunar spacecraft, what do you do if the pilot dies? Well, with this knowledge, you'll be able to take over. One of the key things you need to have as a skill in life. So here, we're just seconds away from the engine ignition to land. We're running program 63. A couple seconds, 5 seconds before engine ignition, the computer asks us effectively, are you sure? Verb 99. Okay, are you sure you want to fire the engine? And you just hit the proceed key. 5 seconds later, it starts cranking up. It shows you your velocity, time until ignition, which, I just tagged this at 3 seconds. And then you have how much you're slowing down from the engine. One of the great things is that, okay, we have all this fancy technology. It was absolutely beyond the state of the art in the 1960s. How do you know the computer's working, especially when you can't see the moon? It turns out you have a cheat sheet Velcroed to the instrument panel. And it's tagged, if you look at, it might be a bit tough to see, but if you look at the column on the far left, it's the time from ignition in 30-second hacks. And it should be what attitude you're at, your velocity, how fast you're descending, we call that H dot, so on and so on, how much the descent engine fuel is using, and your antenna angles in case you lost contact with the ground. But again, we get back to the verb and noun. Verb 6, again, is display data. Noun 63 is your descent monitor. And you can see the little arrows pointing to the key numbers that the computer has calculated, and hopefully that's really where you are, that you would match up against the cheat sheet. It is this simple. And you thought you were going to be studying for days on this. The final approach phase, we changed to program 64. Again, we have verb 6 for displaying data, and then noun 64 are monitoring for this phase. Two numbers squeezed into one of the data registers come up. One of them is how many seconds you have until you have to either land or make some sort of decisions. Here we have it as 56 seconds. Landing point designator. Now we're all comfortable. Oh, altitude rate, that's how fast you're descending and your altitude. Now, altitude rate, boy, that sounds 600 feet, per second, you think, and 2,900 feet in altitude. Well, astronauts are smart, and it actually costs a lot in computer time and effort to put in decimal points. That's really 63.2 feet per second down. But the landing point designator, we're all very, very comfortable today. And if we do any flight simulator software, we're comfortable with what's called a head-up display, where you get all of your information and where you're going and that kind of good stuff. These hadn't been invented, but they had the most brilliant, wonderful, screaming, high-tech, it was clever, way for the computer to tell the pilots where they were headed to. And here we go. This is the landing point designator on the lunar module. It's just a set of painted lines on the panel that are separated by about an inch. And the idea is, if you find out, if the computer says, say on here, we're coming down at 52 degrees. Well, you look up 52 on the window, 52 degrees, line up the two panels, and that's where you're headed. Just a little bit of paint on the glass. No more simple or difficult than that. You can't make this up. So finally, we're running low on time. We get to our final descent. We go to program 66, again, verb 6 for displaying, and our final descent monitor. The things you really need to know is how fast forward you are, because you want to come to a stop, how fast you're going down, and your altitude. So after that, it's again, manually assisted. As soon as a little probe on the bottom of the landing pads touches the surface, you get a light on that says lunar contact, and you hit the stop button, and mankind will never be the same again, blah, blah, blah. So I think I timed this okay. That's it. And now I'd love to hear people's questions. I know this was a quick thing, but again, hopefully you walk out a little smarter than you walked in.
I have a question, Frank. I'm John.
John, how are you doing today?
Good. Would you say the software was more or less complicated than the software on the unmanned probes like Surveyor?
Oh, okay. Surveyor and most of the other spacecraft of that era were, to call them a computer is a bit of a stretch. They were programmable sequencers. They didn't have any kind of autonomous, independent calculating ability. They weren't, again, I'm stretching things to make the point, but they weren't a whole heck of a lot more sophisticated than the ASICs or the FPGAs that you have in a lot of devices today. They weren't computing, but between the analog electronics and the basic decision-making a sequencer could do, can you call that a computer? Oh, that's a little bit tough.
I guess because the lag time is so small between the Earth and the Moon that I guess you would need that, whereas like with Mars, for example.
Oh yeah, 7 minutes of terror.
You have that for an 8-minute round trip as opposed to, what was it like? I used to hear them, talking, I guess it was half duplex. What about it? 1 second delay round trip from the Moon to the Earth?
Round trip is 2.5.
2.5. All right. So,
and honestly, by the time so many decisions, all of these landings, the human ones and the unmanned ones, once they started down, they were on their own. The human decision-making process just doesn't react fast enough. If you're working with something that, oh my God, I have a second to fix it, you're not going to be able to do it in that amount of time. You just won't.
I noticed on your images of the windows that there were actually two sets of hack marks. Is that due to the different heights of the?
Did I leave that out? There were several layers of windows: a pressure window, a safety window, etc. These were two different. And let me see if I can do a quick share here, if you don't mind me, just indulging myself. Come on, dummy. Yeah. Yes, on the two panes, the inner and outer pane of the glass, you will have that. And that allows you to visualize this as a parallax. And you would have to cite both little spots on the glass, or both little lines. If it was only done with the one, well, if you're a tall person or a short person, you'd get it all wrong. So you can see that there are two, and they are slightly scaled differently, just so that you're able to get that proper angle defined. Let me. Oh,
So
did I not share? I'm sorry. Excuse me.
It becomes a second point on the line between the eye and the target.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't have my screen share working. Is that better? You can see the picture again?
We cannot.
Oh, bummer. You should. I should be. No, come on. Oh, you.
There you go.
There we go. I'm so sorry. And so again, you can see that there's two sets of lines. They're different colors, so you can tell them apart, but you don't really need to. For example, again, you can see over on the left, the numbers are centered at 40. And that's where if you were told that you're going at 40 degrees down to the surface, or going on a glide slope, if you want to call it, at a 40-degree angle, just take a look through the window, line them up, and yeah, that's where you're headed. And it was pretty accurate. I'm going to go into the chat. Let me see here.
Can I just thank you for your book, and like hearing that audio now from Houston, where the guys say, like, we finally start to breathe. Now you realize what was happening. He was forced to go to manual, I guess, because of all those false interrupt from the landing module radar. And I guess he probably wasn't using fuel efficient. His computer, he nearly ran out of fuel.
Oh, there's lots of urban legend on this. First off, the problem with the computer, it wasn't a switch in the wrong position. It turned out there were some non-terminated resistors in the radar that had a quirk with them. It was a power supply problem fundamentally. And without apparently some terminating resistors, the power supply got screwed up. You had two separate power supplies, 400 hertz running. They were spec'd to stay in sync. Okay, fine. But they weren't spec'd, and this was the problem, to be phase synchronized. So it was just a quirk of when you turned on your inverters that how much in phase or out of phase. And they actually saw some of this during testing, but they didn't know what to make of it. Once they dug deep into it, they did find out. The problem manifested itself. And again, this was not a switch position problem. That's all urban legend. They ended up getting one of the radar units started doing basically what today we'd call a hot IO, and just flooded the computer with interrupts. This stole processing cycles. And after that, when it got into some rather heavy processing, it just said, okay, I have to schedule all this work. Remember, it's multitasking. And it, just like in any other computer, tasks are being created and destroyed. It's like, I need to start running a new task because that's what I'm scheduled to do. Well, I don't have enough process slots. Remember, I could only run up to 7. And because the interrupts were stealing all the cycles in the processor, it just didn't have time to finish. They were actually running expected at about 85%, and they were pinned at 100% CPU. And we know what happens when our CPUs max out. So the system, the executive, the OS, looks around and goes, I don't have any more process slots. And it generates an alarm. The solution was, I don't need to reboot, because if I reboot, I'm going to lose all my navigation data. All I need to do is just stop the work that's happening right now and throw it away. And because every program has a restart point, I can just restart stuff from the beginning. And that was all that they needed to get themselves down. They were running low on fuel. They thought the gauges inside the spacecraft were all coming back saying, hey guys, you're got just a minute or two left. But because of all the maneuvering Neil Armstrong was doing to avoid a big crater and all the rocks in the area, the spacecraft was flopping around and he was being rather aggressive. The fuel tanks were almost empty and the fuel was just sloshing around. Because of that, it was prematurely showing that the tanks were almost empty. We hear the story that Neil Armstrong had landed with 20 seconds or something like that. There was a large cushion already built in, about additional 20 seconds. But by the time they landed and they started looking at the numbers, it turned out they had about a minute and a half. So it wasn't nearly as close as reported, air quotes.
Or as they thought at the time. I mean.
Oh, very much. No, that was something that was really, oh my God, we came close on that one. And they truly believed it at the time. Later analysis, of course, proved that out. On later missions, what they did was that inside the fuel tanks, they put these baffles, just little sheets of aluminum, to keep that sloshing down to a minimum. And the fuel numbers that they were landing with were far, far, far more accurate.
Can you tell me about what the T-minus landing time was for when the guidance computer was turned off and that Armstrong went manual?
I have that data. I don't know exactly offhand. If you want, a dear friend of mine who edits one of the Apollo, who is really one of the primary editors of the Apollo journals, a gentleman by the name of David Woods, lives in Scotland. He does marvelous videos, completely annotated, very cleverly done. He's a video editor for the BBC. And so Google for Apollo 11 landing, and it's presented by the Apollo Flight Journal. These are the two journals. Again, I work on the Lunar Surface Journal and the Flight Journal, and he's the primary editor for the Flight Journal. Go and look those up. There's countdown clocks that's so wonderfully annotated. You'll be able to find it out there, and it is a rocking set of videos. He has it for all the moon landings.
Thank you. And to the people watching, the public, it was never announced, right, that he had turned that computer off.
Oh, he didn't turn the computer off. Oh, God, no.
Oh, I thought he did. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, nothing like that. You were totally dependent on it. But he early on, remember in that little list of programs and all, we had the braking phase and the approach phase and the landing phase, the terminal descent. He went at about the appropriate time to that program 66, the manually assisted phase. But that was supposed to be done anyway. Unfortunately, the computer, the spacecraft was already a mile or two off course, which really caused some consternation. It was blindly landing in the center of a really rocky crater. So Neil Armstrong takes a look, goes, this isn't any good. And he could have landed right in the middle of the crater and he would have been killed. So at that point, he took, again, manually assisted control. It's a fly-by-wire system, and scooted over the crater and found a landing spot. And again, you know, humanity's never been the same.
Well, Thank you so much. Thank you for your book, Apollo Guidance Computer.
Thank you.
And,
I hope you enjoyed.
Well, it puts me to sleep every time.
Yeah, well, I've had Amazon reviews that say, one guy in particular, it was, hooray, I'm a winner today. I made it through the first chapter.
No, 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 no. I read it before I go to bed. I fill my head with as much as I can. And about 30 to 40% of the time, I do get a moon landing dream. So I read it specifically so that I dream about being an astronaut right before bed.
There you go.
And it's great.
Frank, I'd like to ask, Buzz Aldrin was listed as the lunar module pilot. So why was it that Neil Armstrong was doing that final fly down to the moon?
Okay, well, he was the commander. Now, the pilot, everyone, all these people are pilots in their other lives. No one wanted to say that, no one wanted to take on the title, which was the original designation back in 62 or 63. The second person in the cockpit was simply called the systems engineer. Well, by God, I'm a test pilot. I'll be damned if I'm not going to be called a pilot. Now, understand, and when you listen to the radio chatter, Neil Armstrong, the whole idea is that the guy flying, his objective is to keep his eyeballs outside the window. He doesn't want to be concerned, aside from, in your peripheral vision, about all the flashing lights and instruments and gauges and so on. That's the job of the lunar module pilot. And most of the audio that you hear is Buzz reading off from the computer and other instruments, just speaking and feeding it into the commander. And this worked out rather well. They actually used this exact same methodology on airliners and on the space shuttle. So even though you have the, quote, pilot flying, remember, half the time you're on an airliner, it's the co-pilot that does it, or the first officer. They are always interacting. If anything, is a cross-check to each other, reminding folk, oh, you're at X number of feet, this is coming up, et cetera, et cetera. So he was kind of like Hal in 2001. He was providing all the information the commander needed to fly.
Thank you.
And Shane, I'm just getting a touch worried. I know we started perhaps a touch early. What time do we end? What time do we have to be off?
11:10 is our stop time, so you have a few more minutes.
Oh, okay, thank you. Anything else real quick? I don't want to run over because I know this is tightly organized.
Neil has a question in the chat. Could you explain the coordination systems, please?
I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. All right. Yes, they're all Cartesian. You had multiple coordinate systems. For example, here we have a wonderful three-dimensional, oh, come on. Here you have a wonderful three-dimensional orthogonal coordinate system. I've aligned myself to my stars. But what happens if this is up, what we want to call up relative to the spacecraft? What happens if when I'm on the moon? My preferred way of doing it is straight up, forward, and off to the left when I'm flat on the surface. So I have to do a rotation, just a mathematical, it's just a matrix multiply. And these are the different coordinate systems. There's a separate coordinate system for flying from the Earth to the moon, and it's based on where the sun and the Earth orbital plane are. You have another one for the Earth-Moon plane. And so, yes, depending on which different phase of the mission you're in, you actually kept multiple coordinate systems. For those who've read my book, or an outstanding book by my friend David Woods called How Apollo Flew to the Moon, if you ever have to doubt what the book's about, that's it. You will see this called and this is a mouthful, a refermat, a reference to the stable member matrix. And the stable matrix is that three-dimensional thing in space. And it includes the rotations that you need to do. And David does a far better job than I do explaining it. And I can't recommend the book enough. He's a great storyteller. I'm a much better technical writer, but the two of us complement one another well.
So was there something when they recalibrated the IMU, did that create the coordinate system that the computer operated from then on? Or did they continue to do the rotation all the time and just use calibrations?
Okay, and I'm sorry for interrupting, but I realize we're getting short on time. One of the things is that you used particular coordinate system for an extended period. For example, you want to have all of everything pointing up when you're on the launch pad, leaving Earth. Okay, that is kept until you're onto the moon. Then you switch to a different reference system. So you're only using one coordinate system or one refs from mat at a time. There were, by the later missions, 9 different ones, and these were all calculated on the ground. And one of the great things, again, all my watch does is tell the time. The computer on Apollo could easily be updated and not quite reprogrammed, but easily updated from the ground. And so very regularly, they would say, okay, it's time to change to the blah, blah, blah landing site refs format. And they would uplink it. It just takes a couple seconds, and that's the one that they would switch to.
Thank you.
Again, David Woods does a far better job than I do. But I go into more coordinate systems in my book.